You know, when family is in quarantine together, we tend to bother each other, don't we? Yeah, 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 yeah. See, look at that. There's my nephew Carter. He's so handsome. Look at you. He's so handsome.
I feel bullied.
Hello, everyone. This is More Things to Consider When Renting an Apartment. This is DSPS 285 for Apartment Living, Week 4, Lecture 2 with Mr. Carlston. All right. So let's review what we know so far. For Week 4, Lecture 1, we talked about what is a deposit. All right. Deposit is money that you give to your landlord to say that you are seriously interested in an apartment. We also talked about a lease and the terms of a lease. Most leases require you to either live there for an entire month or year. If you decide you want to move out within a month or a few days after signing a lease, you will probably have to pay a penalty, and we'll talk about that more. The penalty for breaking a lease is usually paid in the security deposit. The security deposit is used for any damages you may have caused to the apartment, such as a dirty carpet or holes in the wall. Okay, so there's more to say about that. We also talked about a pet policy. We also talked about the pet policy. There is a deposit you must pay and a monthly fee added to your rent. For example, an apartment may have a $500 pet deposit when I move in. Then there's $50 added to my rent for having a pet. If I have more than one pet, the apartment complex can charge $50 per pet. So it can get pricey. Okay. We also talked about a guest policy. If I have friends over or spend the night, I might have to check them in with security. Guests who roam around an apartment complex can be easily seen as burglars, so you must let security know who they are. Also, if they stay more than 1 week, your landlord can decide to change the lease and start charging your friend as a roommate. All right, so you have to read your lease agreement. That's the most important thing. All right, so lease agreements. Again, a lease agreement is a contract to agree to live in your apartment for a specific length of time. You can usually agree to live in your apartment month to month, meaning when you pay rent, that guarantees or says you can live in your apartment for 30 days. That's 1 month. However, with a month-to-month lease, your landlord can decide to increase your rent. For example, you may pay $800 in December, then your landlord can decide to increase the rent to $1,000 in January. This would make your rent a variable expense because it can always change. That is with a month-to-month. You can also do an annual or yearly lease. You promise to live in your apartment for at least a year. The advantage is that for 1 year, the rent will never increase or decrease, so it is a fixed expense. However, for whatever reason you decide to move out within that year, you must pay a penalty for breaking the lease term. This money comes out of your security deposit. Which is better for you, an annual, yearly, or a month-to-month lease? So that is something to consider. Okay, so penalties for month-to-month or yearly lease agreements. So with life happening, ask your apartment complex if there is a penalty for breaking the lease. If there is a penalty, there is nothing wrong with asking how much it is. Fix that really quick. All right. Usually the money for a penalty comes out of the security deposit. Remember, a security deposit is money given to the landlord in case there's damage to the apartment or if the renter, who is you, decides to break the terms of the lease. So if you move out and the apartment is cleaner than when you got it and there are no violations of your lease, you can actually get a portion of the money back from your security deposit, or maybe get the whole thing back. Now, so important thing to consider when you're renting an apartment. Ask, how often do they raise the rent? So depending upon if you sign a month-to-month or yearly lease, how much does the landlord raise the rent? This is where percentages help. They will either tell you 10%, 15%, or maybe 25%. Either way, they have to tell you in advance how much they are going to raise the rent. They must also tell you when they're going to raise the rent too. So, how much and when? How much is the rent going to be raised and when will it be increased? They must give you at least 30 days in advance. Here's an example. Steve signed a month-to-month lease to live in an apartment. His landlord says that she is going to raise or increase the rent by 15% starting in January. Steve was told in December. He pays $1,200 for rent, so how much will his rent increase? So you need to calculate what is 15% of $1,200. So 15 times 100 equals 0.15. 0.15 times 1,200 equals $180. Actually, this would be 15%, not 15. All right. So Steve's rent will increase by $180. Therefore, his rent will be from $1,200 and will now be $1,380. This is with a 15% increase of rent. All right. This is why we did percentages. All right. Okay. If you plan to move from your apartment, how much advance notice must you give? In the lease agreement, there is always a rule that says you must give a certain amount of days to tell them when or if you are going to move. For example, if I plan on moving out of my apartment complex in January, I must tell the landlord that I'm moving out by December 1st. This is giving at least a 30-day notice of when I promise to be out of the apartment. Some apartments require I tell them at least 60 days or 2 months in advance. So read the lease agreement and make sure how much notice you need to give. What does an apartment complex require a 30-day or 60-day notice of when you plan on moving out? Okay, so that's part of the lease agreement. You need to find that out. Okay, how secure or safe is the neighborhood? For many of you, this may be very important. How safe is the neighborhood where your apartment is? If you leave your bicycle at your front door, can you trust it will be there in the morning when you need it to go to work? Or knowing you have valuable stuff in your apartment, must you always securely lock your doors? Maybe there is so much crime in your neighborhood that you might have to buy a secure steel screen door in addition to the front door. This is very important because this is your home and you want to feel safe at your home. If you do not feel safe and are currently worried about being safe in your neighborhood, maybe there's another safer place. All right? Okay, another thing to consider is parking. What is the parking situation like at this apartment? If you drive a car, how far must you park away from your apartment? Is there assigned parking or is it like a parking lot? And if the parking lot is full, you must park further away from your apartment. Is the parking convenient or inconvenient? Okay. All right, so let's review. We talked about lease agreements is either month to month or yearly. Depending upon the lease agreement, the landlord can also raise or increase your rent either monthly or every year. 3. If you decide to move before the time your lease agreement expires, what is the penalty for violating the terms of your lease? Okay. 4. How much advance notice do you need to give if you plan on moving out of your apartment? Number 5. How safe is your neighborhood? And number 6. What is the parking situation like at your apartment? If you have guests, do they have to park for? Okay. So homework and assignments. For week 4, lecture 2, take the survey quiz. It will ask, how safe do you think the neighborhood is? What is the penalty for breaking the lease and how much is it? How far in advance must you give notice if you want to move out of the apartment complex? How often is the rent raised? Is it a percentage? Remember, it depends if you have a month-to-month or an annual lease. All right? If you have questions, email me or call me. All right? So I'm going to show you the homework. This is from the week 4 lecture and homework. All right, so this is the quiz. You talk about how much the landlord can raise the rent, how much is your neighborhood, how safe is your neighborhood, and other things such as parking. After you watch the lecture, answer the questions in the quiz, and you're good to go. So, this question asks, which is better for you, a month-to-month or annual yearly lease? Remember, a month-to-month lease is one that the landlord can decide to raise the month every month. So it is a variable expense. If you sign a yearly rent, it stays fixed or does not change for 1 year. Right? The disadvantage is that with a yearly lease, you must commit to living in the apartment for at least 365 days or 1 year. So which do you think is better for you, month to month or an annual yearly lease? Okay. Now, how often is the rent raised or increased at your apartment? If it is raised, by how much? Is it a percentage? If you do a month to month, it could be raised every month. If you do an annual lease, it could be raised every year. Now, every apartment is different, so how much advance notice must you give if you plan on moving out of your apartment? 30 days, 60 days, or longer, or shorter? Okay. Question 4. If you break the terms of the lease, such as deciding to leave within a few days after agreeing to stay in your apartment for 1 year, what is the penalty? Penalties are very expensive, right? Question 5. What is the parking situation like at your apartment complex? Do they have a big parking lot or a garage parking? Do your guests have to park for away if they want to visit you? Where do you have to park, right? Question 6. How safe do you think your neighborhood is? Does the landlord recommend you buy a safe or lock for your valuables? And the important thing is, do you feel safe in your home if you lived in these apartments? All right. And I think that's it. So there are no right or wrong answers. You just have to fill out this information based on your own research. If you have any questions, let me know. All right. I'll talk to you guys soon.